In the blistering Mojave Desert at Red Ridge Military Training Facility, a battle-scarred instructor was about to face her greatest test. What started as routine weapons training took a shocking turn when young Marines came face-to-face with systematic sabotage and a deadly assault force. Master Gunnery Sergeant Reba Red Harlow wasn't your typical drill instructor. For 20 years, she had spent her life in combat zones from Afghanistan to Iraq, known for her uncanny ability to survive impossible odds with nothing but an antique Winchester shotgun nicknamed Dusty. When they encountered enemy mercenaries targeting her specifically for revenge, they had no idea they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap designed to eliminate every survivor of the Firebase Delta siege. Harlow's response, transforming mocking recruits into guerrilla fighters using improvised tactics, and her museum-piece weapon, would lead to a legendary last stand that exposed an international conspiracy. What began as young Marines ridiculing outdated methods would become a masterclass in survival against overwhelming technological superiority. The military training world would never be the same after 5 soldiers with minimal equipment defeated a professional assault force, proving that sometimes the oldest weapons forge the strongest warriors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but Master Gunnery Sergeant Reba Red Harlow was already awake. At 52, she had long stopped needing artificial wake-up calls. Her body clock ran on military precision, a habit forged through 2 decades of service that refused to fade even 3 years into her instructor role at Red Ridge Military Training Facility. Reba rolled out of her narrow cot in the instructor's quarters, her joints protesting with familiar aches. The helicopter crash in Afghanistan had left her with a permanent limp and a collection of scars that told stories she'd never share, but her hands remained steady as a surgeon's, and her eyes still held the predatory focus that had once made her one of the military's most feared combat instructors. By 5:15 a.m., she was at the armory, signing out the weapon that had become her closest companion. The Winchester Model 1897 looked like it had been through a war zone, which, of course, it had. The original blued finish had worn away to bare metal in places, and the wooden stock bore countless scratches and dings. A piece of black electrical tape held the butt plate together, and the barrel showed the telltale signs of field repairs. "Morning, old friend," Reba whispered, running her weathered fingers along the pump-action mechanism. She'd fired over 200 rounds through this weapon in combat, each shot carefully calculated, each one meant to bring someone home alive. The young Marines started arriving at 6 a.m. for morning drills, and Reba could already hear their voices echoing across the desert training grounds. She positioned herself at the instructor's station, methodically checking her shotgun with the kind of reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. "Holy crap, would you look at that thing?" Private First Class Alex Kim snorted, pointing at Reba's weapon. "I think I saw one of those in a museum last week." His buddy, Private Jenna Cruz, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The other recruits gathered around, the morning air filling with mocking laughter, as Private Danny Cole, fresh out of basic training, with all the cockiness that came with it, stepped forward with a grin that made Reba's jaw tighten. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Danny said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "if that antique can actually cycle shells without jamming, I could probably qualify for the Olympics with a slingshot." The laughter grew louder. Reba's grip on her shotgun remained steady, but something flickered behind her dark eyes. Not anger, but something deeper. Something that had been buried under years of quiet service and unspoken sacrifices. "Tell you what, Sergeant," Kim continued, emboldened by his audience. "Why don't you let me show these recruits what a real weapon looks like?" He hefted his brand-new M4 carbine, complete with state-of-the-art optics and pristine finish. "This baby can reach out and touch someone at 400 meters. No problem." Reba said nothing. She simply stood up, walked to the equipment table, and began setting up training scenarios. Her movements were economical, practiced, like she'd done this exact routine thousands of times before. "Oh, she's actually going to try to demonstrate with that thing," whispered Private Lisa Thompson, pulling out her phone to record. "This should be good for a laugh." Quote, what none of them knew was that tucked away in Reba's small quarters was a faded photograph, face down in a drawer she rarely opened. On the back, in barely legible handwriting, were the words, Kunar Province, 2010. Never forget the 7 hours. They didn't know that Reba held an unofficial record that would never appear in any official military documents. They didn't know about the siege at Firebase Delta, or how she'd held off an entire Taliban assault with nothing but Dusty and 6 shells, while her unit was pinned down with no hope of rescue. They didn't know that the museum piece they were mocking had saved more American lives than all their fancy new equipment combined. From the observation tower, Sergeant Major Victor Iron Watts watched through binoculars, his expression stern. At 45, Watts represented the new Marine Corps, all efficiency, technology, and modernization. He'd been quietly building a case for Reba's forced retirement, viewing her outdated methods as an embarrassment to the facility. Specs, Watts called to Corporal Lionel Banks, the base armory technician who was cataloging equipment nearby. How long has Harlow been carrying that relic? Specs adjusted his thick glasses nervously. Since she arrived, sir. 3 years, 2 months, 18 days. He paused, then added quietly, It's never failed inspection, sir. I maintain it personally. Watts grunted disapprovingly. The Marine Corps has moved beyond trench warfare, Corporal. Maybe it's time our instructors did, too. Back on the training ground, Reba had finished setting up a complex scenario involving multiple targets at varying distances. The recruits continued their jokes, but private crews had grown quiet, studying the scars on Reba's hands and the way she handled her weapon with absolute confidence. Target Sequence Alpha, Reba announced quietly, her voice carrying across the range despite its softness. 6 shots, 6 targets, 45 seconds. The laughter resumed immediately. 6 shots from a pump-action shotgun in 45 seconds was ambitious even for an expert, and the targets Reba had selected were positioned at challenging angles and distances. Lady, I can barely see half those targets, Kim scoffed. You sure you don't need to borrow some reading glasses? Reba settled into her shooting stance, and suddenly her entire demeanor changed. The slight stoop in her shoulders straightened, her breathing became measured and controlled, and her eyes took on a laser focus that made even Watts lean forward in interest. For just a moment, the worn-out instructor disappeared, and something else took her place. Something that had survived ambushes, eliminated threats, and carried the weight of life-and-death decisions for 20 years. What the recruits couldn't see was the complex calculation running through Reba's mind. Wind speed, target distance, spread patterns, even the slight vibration in the ground from a supply truck passing 200 meters away. This was what 2 decades of combat experience looked like. Not flashy equipment or perfect conditions, but knowledge earned in places where missing meant your teammates didn't come home. Crews stepped closer, drawn by something in Reba's bearing that the others had missed entirely. The morning sun climbed higher over the Mojave as the recruits gathered for weapons inspection. Private Kim had spent the better part of the night crafting what he considered the perfect prank, one that would finally prove the old sergeant's relic was nothing more than a decoration. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Reba announced, setting Dusty on the inspection table alongside the recruits' modern firearms. Standard field strip and reassembly. Show me you can maintain your weapons when the armory is 50 clicks away and you're eating sand. As the recruits began disassembling their rifles with practiced efficiency, Kim made his move. While Reba inspected Thompson's M4, he slipped behind the table and worked quickly on Dusty's action. The firing pin came out easily, just a simple removal that would render the weapon completely inoperative while leaving it looking perfectly normal. There, he whispered to Cole, who was standing watch. Let's see the old-timer try to fire that museum piece now. But Kim had made a crucial error. Dusty wasn't just Reba's personal weapon. It was integrated into the base's security grid through an antiquated but functional sensor system that Specs had jerry-rigged years earlier. The shotgun's firing pin was connected to a pressure sensor that monitored the instructor's position during live-fire exercises, part of an outdated safety protocol that most people had forgotten existed. When Kim removed the pin, he inadvertently disabled a critical node in the base's perimeter defense network. 20 minutes later, as the recruits finished their inspection, Reba picked up Dusty and immediately noticed something wrong. Her fingers traced the action with the sensitivity of a master craftsman, and her expression hardened like granite. Interesting, she said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made crews step back instinctively. Reba's eyes swept across the assembled recruits, and when her gaze locked onto Kim, he felt like a deer caught in headlights. "Something wrong with your weapons, Sergeant?" Kim asked, trying to sound casual despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Reba said nothing. She simply stared at Kim with the kind of look that had once made Taliban fighters abandon their positions. The silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, until finally Reba looked away and continued the inspection as if nothing had happened. But Kim's relief was short-lived. As the recruits dispersed for afternoon chow, Specs appeared at his elbow like a ghost. "Real funny, Private," Specs said, his usual good humor completely absent. "You think you know what's funny? Let me tell you what's funny." He pulled Kim aside, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Funny is watching a woman hold off 40 Taliban fighters with 6 shells and a prayer. Funny is seeing someone carry 3 wounded Marines through a minefield because she was the only one left standing. Funny is surviving 7 hours of hell that would break your mind in 7 minutes." Kim's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't," Specs replied, adjusting his glasses. "But let me give you some free advice, hotshot. That woman has been through hell none of you can imagine. She doesn't carry that shotgun because it's pretty. She carries it because it's the reason half her old unit is still breathing." As Specs walked away, Kim felt a knot forming in his stomach. Around him, the other recruits were still laughing about the morning's events, but suddenly their jokes didn't seem so funny anymore. That evening, Reba sat alone in her quarters, holding a sealed envelope that had been slipped under her door. Inside was a faded military patch, the insignia of her old unit from Afghanistan, and a photograph she hadn't seen in years. 7 Marines in full combat gear, standing in front of Firebase Delta with the Hindu Kush Mountains rising behind them. Reba's finger traced the faces of the men who hadn't made it home, lingering on the young woman standing beside her. Specialist Nadia Rahimi, radio operator, age 22. "Dusty," Reba whispered to the shotgun propped against her footlocker. "They don't know what we've been through, do they?" The weapon, of course, didn't answer. But in the silence of her quarters, Reba could almost hear the echoes of mortar rounds and the static-filled voice of Rahimi calling in coordinates during the longest night of her life. The morning briefing room felt like an interrogation chamber as Reba sat across from Sergeant Major Watts, her service records spread across the table between them like evidence in a court-martial. Sunlight streamed through the narrow windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air, and the deep lines etched around Watts' eyes. "Harlow," Watts began, his voice carrying the weight of administrative authority, "we need to discuss your methods. 3 years you've been here, and every quarterly review mentions the same thing: outdated equipment, unconventional training techniques, resistance to modernization." Reba sat perfectly still, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Sir, my training results speak for themselves. Highest qualification rates in the facility, lowest washout percentage." "That's not the point," Watts interrupted, leaning forward. "The Marine Corps has evolved, Sergeant. We use technology now, not folklore. That antique you carry isn't regulation, and frankly, it sends the wrong message to the recruits." The words hit Reba like a physical blow, transporting her instantly to another briefing room, another conversation, another superior who refused to listen. "Afghanistan, 2010. Forward Operating Base Chapman." "Colonel, with respect, the intelligence reports are clear," Reba had said, standing at attention before Colonel Barnes' desk. "Unusual radio chatter, supply movement patterns, IED placement, everything indicates a major assault on Firebase Delta within 72 hours. Barnes barely looked up from his paperwork. "Sergeant, we have satellites, drones, and electronic surveillance that tell us more about enemy movements than your gut feelings. The Firebase is secure." "Sir, I've been in country for 18 months. I know how they operate." "What you know," Barnes cut her off, "is maintenance and logistics. Leave tactics to the officers, Sergeant. Dismissed." Back in the present, Watts was still talking. "Understand that your service record is exemplary, but times change. The modern Marine Corps needs instructors who embrace technology, not cling to museum pieces." Reba's jaw tightened. "That museum piece has saved more lives than..." "Than what? Than satellite imagery? Than thermal optics? Than precision-guided munitions?" Watts shook his head. "Harlow, I'm trying to help you here. Take early retirement, full pension, full benefits. Go out with dignity. instead of fighting a war you can't win. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Reba stood, her movements careful and controlled. "Permission to return to duty, sir?" Watts sighed. "Granted. But Harlow, this conversation isn't over." As Reba left the briefing room, her mind was already back in Afghanistan, reliving the weight of ignored warnings and the price of institutional arrogance. She made her way to the armory, where she found Specs hunched over a workbench, carefully cleaning and reassembling Dusty. "Firing pin was removed," Specs said without looking up. "Clean extraction, no damage. Your boy Kim knows his way around a weapon, I'll give him that." "Any idea why he'd do something that stupid?" Specs set down his cleaning rod and finally met her eyes. "Same reason kids poke at caged animals, I suppose. They don't understand what they're messing with." He handed her the shotgun, fully restored to working condition. "There's something else, though." When he pulled that pin, it triggered a cascade failure in Sector 7 of the perimeter grid. Nothing major, just a blind spot about 50 meters wide. Reba frowned. "You reported it?" "Of course. Watts says it's a low priority. They'll get to it when they get to it." Specs turned back to his work, then paused. "Reba, you know I was in Iraq, right? 4th Infantry, combat engineer. I know what it's like when the brass doesn't listen to the people on the ground." She nodded, understanding passing between them without words. "That shotgun never failed you," Specs continued quietly. "In all the maintenance logs, all the repair requests, all the inspections, perfect record. Whatever happened over there, whatever you two went through, it kept you alive. That means something." Reba accepted Dusty, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon in her hands. Taped to the stock was a small note in Specs' handwriting. "It never failed you. You never failed us." Quote. That evening, as Reba walked the perimeter of the training facility, she noticed Private Cruz sitting alone on the barracks steps, reading something by the light of her phone. As Reba approached, Cruz quickly closed whatever she was looking at and stood at attention. "At ease, Private. What are you reading?" Cruz hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "Just some research, Sergeant, about the Winchester Model 1897. I was curious about its service history." Reba raised an eyebrow. "Find anything interesting?" "Well, it was used extensively in World War I, nicknamed the trench broom, and then I found some references to more recent conflicts." Cruz paused, studying Reba's expression. "Sergeant, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Why do the others think your weapon is a joke? From what I've read, it's one of the most reliable shotguns ever made. Pump action, simple mechanism, devastating at close range. In the right hands, Private, any weapon is deadly. In the wrong hands, the fanciest equipment in the world won't save you." Reba looked out across the desert, where the lights of distant mountains twinkled like stars. "Your buddies think technology makes them invincible. They'll learn different when the satellites go down and the batteries die." Cruz nodded slowly. "Sergeant, what happened in Afghanistan?" For a moment, Reba's carefully maintained composure cracked, and Cruz caught a glimpse of something raw and painful in the older woman's eyes. "Nothing that concerns you, Private. Get some sleep." As Reba walked away, Cruz pulled out her phone again and resumed reading. She'd found something in the declassified military reports, a brief mention of Firebase Delta, a siege, and a master gunnery sergeant whose name had been redacted from the official record. But Cruz was persistent, and she was beginning to piece together a story that would change everything she thought she knew about the quiet woman with the antique shotgun. In her quarters, Reba lay on her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and listening to the desert wind rattle the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the ghost of Nadia Rahimi's voice over the radio. "Red 6, this is Overwatch. Multiple contacts inbound from the north. We're about to be overrun." Reba closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness. "Copy that, Overwatch. Hold fast. Help is coming." But help hadn't come in time. It never did. The barracks computer lab was empty at 2,100 hours, save for Private Cruz, hunched over a terminal, her face illuminated by the blue glow of classified military databases. She'd been at this for 3 hours, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of redacted reports and cross-referenced casualty lists. Finally, she found it buried in a Department of Defense after-action report. Firebase Delta Incident, Kunar Province, Afghanistan, September 15 to 16, 2010. The document was heavily censored, but Cruz had learned to read between the black lines. One name kept appearing in the unredacted portions: Specialist Nadia Rahimi, KIA, radio operator, posthumous Bronze Star. Gotcha, Cruz whispered, screenshotting the document before the system could log her out. 3 miles away, in her Spartan quarters, Reba Harlow was fighting a war that had ended 13 years ago. The nightmare always started the same way. The morning briefing, where Colonel Barnes dismissed her intelligence reports, the casual arrogance of men who confused rank with wisdom. Firebase Delta is a hardened position, Barnes had said, pointing at satellite imagery with his coffee-stained stylus. Reinforced bunkers, overlapping fields of fire, early warning systems. The Taliban would need a regiment to threaten that position. Sir, Reba had replied, her voice carefully controlled. The chatter we're intercepting suggests coordinated movement from 3 directions. Vehicle-borne IEDs, mortar teams, at least 60 fighters. Intelligence estimates put enemy strength at 20, maybe 30 fighters max, Barnes interrupted. Your job is to maintain our equipment, Sergeant, not second-guess professional intelligence analysts. The dismissal had stung, but not as much as what came next. As Reba gathered her papers to leave, Barnes added with a condescending smile. Besides, if there really was a threat, we'd send real Marines to handle it, not a maintenance crew. In her dream, Reba could feel the weight of Dusty in her hands as she'd loaded the transport helicopter that would take her small team to Firebase Delta. 7 Marines total. Herself, Rahimi on radio, Corporal Martinez as medic, PFC Johnson and Williams on security, Lance Corporal Thompson handling logistics, and Private First Class Ahmed as interpreter. The dream always skipped ahead to the siege itself, the moment when Barnes' professional intelligence analysts proved catastrophically wrong. Red 6, this is Overwatch. Rahimi's voice crackled through the radio, barely audible over the sound of incoming mortars. We've got movement on all vectors, north, east, and south. Jesus Christ, there's got to be 100 of them. Reba had pressed herself against the concrete wall of the communications bunker, Dusty clutched across her chest. Through the firing port, she could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies across the valley floor. The Taliban had come in force, just as she'd predicted, and Firebase Delta's skeleton crew was about to be overwhelmed. Overwatch, Red 6 copies. What's our status on reinforcements? Static, then Rahimi's voice, tighter now. Red 6, be advised. Command says no reinforcements available for 6 hours minimum. We're on our own. 6 hours. Reba had looked around the bunker at her 6 Marines, then at the radio equipment that represented their only link to the outside world. Mathematics had never been her strong suit, but she could calculate survival odds with grim precision. 7 Marines with limited ammunition against a reinforced Taliban assault meant they had maybe 30 minutes before being overrun. All right, listen up, Reba had said, her voice cutting through the chaos of incoming fire. We hold this position until help arrives, or until there's nobody left to hold it. Rahimi, you stay on the radio. Keep calling for support, even if nobody answers. Martinez, you're treating wounded. Everyone else, we set up overlapping fields of fire and make every shot count. Sergeant, Thompson had said, his young face pale with fear, what if they break through? Reba had cycled a shell into Dusty's chamber, the familiar mechanical click somehow reassuring amid the pandemonium. Then we make them pay for every inch. Reba woke with a gasp, her sheets soaked in sweat and her heart hammering against her ribs. Dusty leaned against her footlocker exactly where she'd left it. But in the darkness of her quarters, she could almost hear the echo of mortar rounds and the desperate voices of Marines who'd trusted her to bring them home. She sat up, running trembling fingers through her graying hair. The clock read 0347 hours, still 3 hours until Reveille. But she knew sleep wouldn't come again tonight. It never did after the Firebase Delta dream. Reba stood and walked to her small desk, pulling out the bottom drawer to reveal the photograph Cruz had been researching. 7 young Marines smiled back at her from that September morning in 2010, their faces bright with confidence and youth. She traced each face with her finger, lingering on Nadia Rahimi's warm brown eyes and infectious grin. I'm sorry, kid, Reba whispered to the photograph. I'm sorry I couldn't save you all. The next morning brought scorching heat and a training exercise that would push the recruits to their limits. Reba had designed the scenario based on real-world experience, a simulated patrol through hostile territory with limited resources and no technological backup. "All right, Marines," she announced as the recruits gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. "Today, we're going back to basics. No GPS, no satellite communication, no thermal optics. Just your compass, your map, and your brain. You'll navigate to 3 checkpoints using dead reckoning, establish observation posts, and report enemy movement using hand signals and written messages." Private Kim raised his hand, his expression skeptical. "Sergeant, this is 2023. When would we ever operate without electronic support?" Reba's smile was cold as winter wind. "When the satellites are jammed, Private. When the batteries die. When some Taliban with a $50 radio frequency jammer turns all your fancy equipment into expensive paperweights." She gestured toward the desert training area. "Today, you learn what Marines did for 200 years before someone invented night vision goggles." The exercise began at dawn, with Reba dividing the recruits into 3 teams of 4. Cruz found herself teamed with Kim, Thompson, and a quiet Marine named Davis, who rarely spoke but always listened intently during briefings. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they navigated through the simulated urban environment, a collection of shipping containers and plywood structures designed to mimic Afghan villages, Cruz noticed Reba moving through the terrain with an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings. The older woman seemed to anticipate threats before they materialized, positioning herself at vantage points that provided maximum tactical advantage. "How does she do that?" Davis whispered as they watched Reba disappear into a network of shipping containers, only to reappear 30 seconds later at a position that perfectly flanked their approach route. "Experience," Cruz replied, but privately she wondered if there was something more. The previous night's research had revealed fragments of a story she was only beginning to understand, a story of survival against impossible odds and leadership under the worst possible circumstances. By noon, the temperature had climbed above 110 degrees, and the recruits were struggling. Modern Marines were accustomed to climate-controlled vehicles and abundant water supplies, but Reba had rationed their water to simulate combat conditions. Several recruits were showing signs of heat exhaustion, and Kim's earlier bravado had evaporated along with his sweat. "This is insane," Kim muttered as they took shelter in the shade of a concrete barrier. "No one operates like this anymore. It's not realistic." "Tell that to the Marines in Helmand Province," Cruz replied, taking a careful sip from her water bottle. "Or the guys who got ambushed in Syria when their convoy's electronics got fried by an IED." Kim glared at her. "You're starting to sound like her, all doom and gloom about technology failing. Modern warfare isn't about hiding behind rocks with antique weapons." Before Cruz could respond, the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed across the training area. All 4 Marines instinctively dropped to the ground, their training overriding conscious thought. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing and the distant hum of air conditioning units in the base's permanent structures. Then Reba's voice cut through the silence, calm and professional. "Contact front. Single shooter, approximately 200 meters, elevated position. How do you respond?" The question was directed at Kim's team, but Kim was frozen in place, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. The sound of gunfire, even simulated gunfire, had triggered something primal in his nervous system, reducing him to a terrified recruit who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Cruz took charge without thinking. "Davis, Thompson, flanking positions. Kim, you're with me. We'll provide covering fire while they maneuver." But Kim wasn't moving. He lay pressed against the ground, his breathing rapid and shallow, his eyes wide with something that looked very much like panic. "Kim," Cruz hissed. "Move!" It was Reba who finally broke the spell, appearing beside their position with Dusty cradled in her arms. She knelt beside Kim, her voice gentle but firm. "Easy, son. It's just training. You're safe." Quote. Kim looked up at her, and for a moment the antagonism between them evaporated. In its place was something raw and human. Fear, confusion, and the sudden realization that warfare wasn't a video game or a movie. It was chaos and terror and the constant possibility of death. "I can't," Kim whispered. "I thought I could, but when I heard that shot—" "First time's always the worst," Reba said, settling into a crouch beside him. "Fear's not the enemy, Private. Fear keeps you alive. The trick is learning to use it instead of letting it use you." She helped Kim to his feet, then turned to address the entire group. Combat isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing your job anyway. That's the difference between courage and stupidity. As the training exercise continued, Cruz found herself watching Reba with new understanding. This wasn't just about teaching marksmanship or tactics. It was about preparing young Marines for the psychological reality of combat, for the moment when their training would be all that stood between them and death. The base's command center was a testament to modern military technology, banks of monitors displaying satellite imagery, drone feeds, and sensor data from dozens of remote installations scattered across the Mojave Desert. Technical Sergeant Patricia Mills had been monitoring the displays for 6 hours straight, her eyes glazed with fatigue and caffeine. At 1,347 hours, a small anomaly appeared on screen 7, a brief electromagnetic pulse that lasted exactly 2.3 seconds before disappearing. Mills frowned and ran a diagnostic, but the system reported all parameters normal. She made a note in the log and returned to her coffee. What Mills didn't know was that her brief anomaly had originated from a modified commercial drone, its civilian identification transponder broadcasting false credentials that identified it as a routine surveying aircraft. The drone's operator, working from a nondescript van parked 15 miles from the base perimeter, smiled with satisfaction as his creation slipped past the facility's electronic sensors. "Phase 1 complete," he whispered into his encrypted radio. "Package delivered." The package in question was a sophisticated piece of malware designed to create a cascading failure in the base's integrated defense network. It would take hours to fully propagate through the system, but once activated, it would blind the facility's electronic eyes just long enough for a more direct assault. Meanwhile, Reba was conducting her most unconventional training session yet. She'd assembled the recruits in a section of the base that had been abandoned since budget cuts forced the consolidation of training facilities. A maze of empty buildings and forgotten equipment that provided the perfect setting for what she called improvisation training. "Modern Marines rely too heavily on their gear," Reba announced, standing beside a table covered with seemingly random objects. Lengths of rope, empty food cans, cleaning supplies, maintenance tools, and a collection of items that looked like they'd been scavenged from a junkyard. "When your primary weapon jams, when your radio dies, when your night vision goggles get smashed by shrapnel, what then?" She picked up a length of paracord and began tying knots with practiced efficiency. Combat is about adaptation. You use what you have, not what you wish you had. The rope became a snare, then a tripwire, then a makeshift harness. Everything around you is a potential weapon or tool. The question is whether you're smart enough to see it. Private Cruz stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her caution. "Sergeant, can you teach us some of these techniques?" Reba's smile was genuine for the first time in days. "That's the idea, Private. Kim, Thompson, you're the assault team. Cruz, Davis, you're defending this building with nothing but what you can find in this room. Go." As the recruits scattered to examine their improvised arsenal, Reba moved to an elevated position where she could observe the exercise. From her vantage point, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small aircraft circling the base's perimeter at an altitude that should have triggered automated warnings. She pulled out her field radio and keyed the command frequency. "Base operations, this is Instructor 6. I have visual on an unidentified aircraft, bearing 270, approximately 5,000 feet. The reply came back immediately. "Instructor 6, negative contact on radar, please verify your observation." Reba raised her binoculars and studied the distant speck. It was definitely an aircraft. Small, probably unmanned, flying a pattern that suggested surveillance rather than transit. Her instincts, honed by 2 decades of combat experience, were screaming warnings. Base operations, visual confirmed. Small aircraft, possibly a drone, conducting apparent reconnaissance of facility perimeter. Quote, "Instructor 6, our systems show no airspace violations. Aircraft is probably civilian, well outside restricted zones." The dismissal was all too familiar. Reba could practically hear Colonel Barnes's voice echoing across 13 years. "Leave tactics to the officers, Sergeant." She lowered the radio and continued watching the drone, noting its flight pattern and estimated specifications. Something about the situation felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. It was like trying to remember a word that sat just on the tip of her tongue, present but frustratingly elusive. Below her, the training exercise was proceeding with increasing intensity. Crews had proven surprisingly adept at creating improvised explosive devices from cleaning supplies and electronics, while Kim was learning to fashion fighting positions from abandoned furniture and debris. For the first time since arriving at Red Ridge, the recruits were beginning to understand that warfare wasn't about having the best equipment. It was about having the best ideas. "Sergeant Harlow?" Specs appeared at her elbow, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by concern. "I've been running diagnostics on the perimeter sensors, and I'm seeing some anomalies. Nothing major, but your gut's telling you something's wrong," Reba finished. Specs nodded. "Yeah, how'd you know?" "Because my gut's telling me the same thing," Reba pointed toward the distant drone, now barely visible against the afternoon sky. "That aircraft's been circling for 20 minutes. Command says it's not showing up on radar." "That's impossible. Our radar coverage is absolute within 50 miles. Unless someone's found a way around it." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the recruits adapt to their unconventional training. Crews had fashioned a remarkably effective fighting position from overturned desks and debris, while Kim was learning to use mirrors and reflective surfaces to observe enemy movement without exposing himself. "You know," Specs said quietly, "this is the first time I've seen Kim actually think tactically. Usually he just relies on overwhelming firepower." Reba nodded. "Combat has a way of teaching lessons that peacetime training never can. Sometimes you need to strip away all the fancy gear to rediscover the fundamentals." Quote. As if summoned by her words, Kim appeared at the base of their observation post, his face flushed with exertion but his eyes bright with genuine enthusiasm. "Sergeant, this is incredible. I never realized how much stuff you could improvise from basic materials. Davis rigged a perimeter alarm system using cans and string, and Thompson created a smoke screen from household chemicals. It's like MacGyver meets the Marine Corps." Despite her growing unease about the security situation, Reba found herself smiling. "That's the idea, Private. Your brain is your most important weapon. Everything else is just tools." "I get it now," Kim continued, his earlier antagonism completely forgotten. "When you were talking about relying on your training instead of your equipment, this is what you meant, isn't it?" Before Reba could respond, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission. All personnel, this is base operations. We are experiencing a system-wide communications failure. All electronic equipment is to be considered unreliable until further notice." Reba and Specs exchanged meaningful looks. Around them, the recruits had stopped their exercise and were staring at their suddenly silent radios and dead electronic equipment. "Sergeant," Cruz called from below, "our gear just went dark. Everything. Radios, GPS, night vision, even the electronic sights on our rifles." Reba felt a familiar chill run down her spine. The same sensation she'd experienced in Afghanistan when the Taliban jammed their communications just before the assault on Firebase Delta. History had a way of repeating itself, often in the most dangerous possible circumstances. "Gather round, Marines," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the abandoned training area. "Looks like you're about to get a practical lesson in operating without electronic support." As the recruits assembled around her position, Reba caught sight of the drone again, closer now and definitely conducting detailed reconnaissance of the facility. Her hand found Dusty's familiar weight, and for the first time in years she felt the old familiar tension of approaching combat. "What's the situation, Sergeant?" Cruz asked, her voice steady despite the obvious concern in her eyes. Reba looked around at the young faces surrounding her, Marines who'd grown up with smartphones and GPS, who'd never imagined operating without constant electronic connectivity. In a few hours, or maybe less, their world was about to become very dangerous and very primitive. "The situation, Private, is that we're about to find out if you've been paying attention to my lessons about improvisation." She cycled a shell into Dusty's chamber, the mechanical click somehow reassuring in the electronic silence. "Because I have a feeling we're going to need every trick we can remember." At 1,634 hours, Red Ridge Training Facility went dark. The power failure was total and instantaneous. Lights, air conditioning, computer systems, and communications equipment all died simultaneously. In the sudden silence, the only sounds were the desert wind and the confused voices of Marines trying to understand what had just happened. Sergeant Major Watts was in his office reviewing quarterly training reports when the blackout hit. His first instinct was to reach for his desk phone, but the line was dead. His cell phone showed no signal. Even the emergency lighting systems had failed, leaving him fumbling for the flashlight he kept in his desk drawer. "What the hell?" he muttered, making his way to the window. Outside, the entire base was shrouded in darkness, except for the distant glow of vehicle headlights from the motor pool. In the abandoned training area, Reba's reaction was immediate and instinctive. The moment the lights died, she dropped into a defensive crouch, Dusty at the ready, her eyes scanning the perimeter for threats. Around her, the recruits were still trying to process what had happened. "Is this part of the exercise?" Thompson asked, her voice uncertain. "No," Reba replied grimly. "This is the real thing." She turned to Cruz, who was already checking her weapon and equipment with admirable composure. "Private, I need you to get to the armory and find Specs. Tell him we need manual override on the weapons lockers. Electronic locks will be useless now." "Roger that, Sergeant." Cruz began moving toward the main facility, but Reba caught her arm. "Stay low, move fast, and trust nobody you don't recognize. This isn't a power failure, it's an attack." As Cruz disappeared into the darkness, Reba gathered the remaining recruits around her. In the faint starlight, their faces were pale masks of confusion and growing fear. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Everything you've learned in the past week about operating without technology, it's about to become vital. Kim, what's the first rule of electronic warfare?" Quote. Kim's voice was steady, despite his obvious nervousness. "When the enemy jams your communications, they're preparing to attack." "Exactly. Thompson, what do you do when your night vision fails?" "Use natural light sources, trust your peripheral vision, and move slowly to avoid obstacles." "Good. Davis, how do you navigate without GPS?" "Dead reckoning with compass and map, using terrain features for reference points." Reba nodded approvingly. "Outstanding. Now here's what we're going to do. This facility is under attack. I don't know by whom or how many, but I know the signs. Our job is to link up with base security and establish a defensive perimeter until reinforcements arrive." "Shouldn't we wait for orders from Command?" Kim asked. "Command is probably dealing with the same communication failures we are. In situations like this, initiative is more important than following protocol." Reba checked her watch, a mechanical timepiece that still functioned despite the electronic blackout. "We move in 5 minutes. Everyone check your gear one more time." As the recruits prepared for movement, Reba's mind was racing through tactical possibilities. The sophistication of the attack suggested enemy forces with significant technical capabilities, not random terrorists or opportunistic criminals, but a coordinated military operation. The fact that they'd managed to disable the base's entire electronic infrastructure meant they'd been planning this for months, possibly years. She thought about the drone she'd observed earlier, the security anomalies Specs had mentioned, and Kim's sabotage of Dusty's firing pin. Individually, these events seemed unrelated, but taken together, they painted a picture of systematic reconnaissance and preparation. "Sergeant," Davis whispered, pointing toward the main facility, movement near the command center. Raban raised her binoculars and studied the distant building. Dark figures were moving purposefully around the structure, their silhouettes barely visible against the star-filled sky. They moved with military precision, bounding overwatch, coordinated advance, professional spacing. Definitely not base personnel. "How many?" she asked quietly. "At least 6 that I can see. Probably more inside the building." Reba made a quick decision. Change of plans. We're not linking up with base security. Base security is compromised. Our new mission is to reach the communications tower and get word to higher headquarters. Quote, "What about Sergeant Major Watts?" Thompson asked. "What about him? If he's smart, he's already gone to ground or trying to establish contact with outside forces. If he's not smart, then he's probably dead or captured." Reba's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes betrayed the weight of command decisions. "Our responsibility is to the mission, not to individual personnel." The harsh mathematics of combat were something these young Marines had never faced before. In training, everyone went home at the end of the day. In war, sometimes good people died, despite your best efforts to save them. As they prepared to move toward the communications facility, Cruz reappeared from the direction of the armory, moving in a tactical crouch that would have made any infantry instructor proud. "Sergeant," she whispered as she rejoined the group, "Specs is dead. I found him in the armory with his throat cut. The weapons lockers have been stripped. Someone took everything useful and destroyed the rest. The news hit the group like a physical blow. Specs had been a friend to all of them. The genial technician who'd helped them with equipment problems and shared his extensive collection of bad jokes. The thought of him dying alone and terrified in the dark armory was almost too much to bear. Reba felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, the same emotional numbness that had carried her through 7 hours of hell at Firebase Delta. She couldn't afford to grieve for Specs now, any more than she'd been able to grieve for Nadia Rahimi during the siege. Emotion was a luxury that combat didn't allow. "Did you get any weapons?" she asked Cruz. "Just this." Cruz held up a Beretta M9 pistol with 2 spare magazines. "Everything else was either taken or destroyed." Reba nodded grimly. 1 shotgun and 1 pistol between 5 Marines, facing an unknown number of hostile forces with professional military training and superior equipment. The odds were approximately the same as they'd been at Firebase Delta, hopeless. But hopeless odds had never stopped her before. "All right, Marines," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd faced death and survived. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in the dark against an enemy who's had months to plan this operation. Any questions?" Kim raised his hand, tentatively. "Sergeant, what are our chances?" Reba's smile was sharp as a blade. "Private, our chances depend on whether you've been paying attention to everything I've tried to teach you. If you've learned to think instead of just following orders, if you've learned to improvise instead of relying on equipment, if you've learned to trust your training instead of your technology, then we might just surprise these bastards." She looked around at their faces, seeing fear mixed with determination, confusion mixed with growing resolve. These weren't the same cocky recruits who'd mocked her antique shotgun a week ago. Combat had a way of stripping away illusions and revealing what people were really made of. "Remember," she continued, "we're not trying to win a battle. We're trying to survive long enough to call for help. Speed, stealth, and smart thinking will serve us better than firepower." As they prepared to leave their position, a distant explosion lit up the night sky. The communications tower, their primary objective, erupted in flames and collapsed in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. "Well," Reba said quietly, watching their last hope of outside contact burn against the stars, "I guess we're on our own." The words echoed across 13 years and 7,000 miles, carrying her back to another night when help wasn't coming and survival depended on making the impossible possible. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, she had 4 young Marines who were about to learn what their training really meant. "Movement plan is the same," she announced. "We find a defensible position, gather intelligence on enemy strength and disposition, and wait for an opportunity to strike back." "Strike back with what?" Kim asked, his voice reflecting the desperation they all felt. Reba patted Dusty's stock affectionately. "With whatever we have, Private. Sometimes that's enough." As they moved into the darkness, leaving behind the safety of their improvised training ground, Reba couldn't help but think that Specs would have appreciated the irony. All his careful maintenance of her obsolete weapon was about to be put to the ultimate test. The explosion started at 1,647 hours, turning the Mojave twilight into a hellscape of orange flames and black smoke. Reba counted at least 6 separate detonations across the base perimeter, shaped charges designed to breach the facility's defensive walls at predetermined points. The attackers weren't just sophisticated. They were following a detailed assault plan that could only have been developed with inside knowledge of Red Ridge's layout and vulnerabilities. "Down!" Reba shouted as shrapnel whistled over their heads. The 5 Marines pressed themselves against the concrete wall of an abandoned maintenance building, their world suddenly reduced to the immediate need for survival. Through the chaos, Reba could hear the distinctive chatter of automatic weapons, not the familiar sound of Marine Corps M4s, but something different, foreign, professional. "Sergeant," Cruz whispered, her voice tight with controlled fear, "those aren't standard NATO rounds. Someone's brought serious firepower to this party." Reba nodded grimly. She'd been in enough firefights to recognize the signature of various weapons systems, and what she was hearing suggested their attackers were armed with military-grade equipment that rivaled anything the Marine Corps could field. A new sound joined the symphony of destruction, the high-pitched whine of drone rotors. Not the large surveillance aircraft she'd spotted earlier, but smaller, faster units designed for close combat support. Red tracers began streaking across the compound as the drones engaged targets with lethal precision. Combat drones, Davis observed, his usual quiet demeanor unchanged despite the circumstances, probably armed with micro-missiles and 30mm cannons, were not equipped to deal with aerial threats. Kim looked around at their minimal armament, Dusty, Cruz's pistol, and whatever improvised weapons they could scavenge, and felt despair creeping into his voice. This is hopeless. We're 5 Marines with antique weapons against a coordinated assault force with air support. We should surrender while we can. The suggestion hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around them, the battle for Red Ridge was intensifying, with explosions and gunfire echoing from multiple directions. Through gaps in the wall, they could see armed figures moving through the compound with tactical precision, clearing buildings and eliminating resistance. Reba turned to look at Kim, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Not anger, but a kind of predatory calculation that belonged to someone who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. "Private," she said quietly, "surrendering isn't an option. These people didn't come here to take prisoners. They came here to eliminate witnesses." She gestured toward the burning communications tower. "They've cut us off from outside support and destroyed our ability to call for help. This is an extermination operation, not a raid." Before Kim could respond, the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle echoed across the compound, followed immediately by a scream of pain from somewhere near the motor pool. The enemy was systematically hunting down any surviving base personnel. "What's the plan, Sergeant?" Thompson asked, checking her rifle despite knowing it was nearly useless against their opponent's superior numbers and equipment. Reba was quiet for several seconds, her mind processing tactical options with the cold efficiency that had kept her alive through 2 decades of combat. Finally, she looked up at the burning sky and smiled, an expression that would have terrified anyone who knew her well enough to recognize it. "The plan is simple," she said, pulling Dusty closer to her chest. "We're going to do what Marines do best: improvise, adapt, and overcome. These bastards think they know what they're dealing with, but they've made one critical mistake." "What's that?" Cruz asked. "They brought a high-tech solution to a low-tech problem." Reba began moving along the wall, staying in the shadows cast by the burning buildings. "Their drones, their electronic weapons, their coordinated assault plan, it all depends on systems that can be disrupted, confused, or turned against them." She led them to a drainage culvert that ran beneath the maintenance facility, a remnant of the original construction that didn't appear on any current base schematics. The opening was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it offered concealed movement to a position behind enemy lines. "Thompson, you're our technical specialist now. I need you to think about everything Specs taught you about electronic warfare. How do we disrupt their communications without sophisticated jamming equipment?" Thompson's face lit up with understanding. "Electromagnetic pulse from an improvised device. If we can get close enough to their command post, a simple EMP generator made from household materials could blind their systems long enough for us to strike." "Exactly. Davis, what do you know about drone vulnerabilities?" Davis considered the question seriously. "Limited flight time, dependent on line-of-sight control signals, vulnerable to physical damage from small arms fire if you can hit them, but the real weakness is their automation. They follow predictable flight patterns based on their programming." "Which means we can use those patterns against them," Reba concluded. "Kim, I need you to put aside everything you think you know about modern warfare and start thinking like a guerrilla fighter. What advantages do we have that they don't?" Kim was quiet for a long moment. Then his expression began to change. "We know this terrain intimately. We understand the base layout better than they do, even with their intelligence preparation. And..." He paused, looking at Dusty with new respect. "We have weapons they don't expect us to use effectively." "Outstanding, Cruz, you are our intelligence specialist. What can you tell me about their assault pattern, based on what we've observed?" Cruz had been watching the enemy movement with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to read battlefield indicators. "They're moving in teams of 4, standard fire and maneuver tactics. Professional military training, but they're following a rigid plan. No improvisation, no adaptation to unexpected resistance." Reba nodded with satisfaction. These weren't the same naive recruits who'd mocked her methods a week ago. Combat had a way of bringing out either the best or worst in people, and she was pleased to see that her Marines were rising to the challenge. "All right, here's what we're gonna do," she said, pulling them into a tight circle so she could speak without being overheard. "We split into 2 teams. Cruz and Thompson, you're going to create a diversion at the fuel depot. Something loud and spectacular that will draw their attention and disrupt their communications. Davis and Kim, you're with me. We're going to use the drainage system to get behind their command post and take out their drone operators." "What about after that?" Kim asked. "Even if we succeed, we're still outnumbered 10-1. Reba's smile turned feral. "After that, Private, we're going to show these bastards what happens when you attack United States Marines on American soil." As they prepared to separate, a new sound joined the chaos, the deep rumble of heavy vehicles approaching from the direction of the main gate. Through the smoke and flames, they could see the distinctive silhouettes of armored personnel carriers and what looked like a mobile command vehicle. "They're bringing in reinforcements," Davis observed. "This is bigger than we thought." Reba watched the convoy disappear behind the burning administration building, her mind already calculating new tactical possibilities. The enemy's decision to establish a forward command post meant they were planning to hold the base rather than simply destroy it, which suggested this wasn't a terrorist attack, but something far more serious. "Change of plans," she announced. "This is a full-scale military operation, not a raid. Our mission is no longer survival, it's intelligence gathering. We need to find out who these people are and what they want with Red Ridge." "And how do we do that?" Cruz asked. Reba cycled a shell into Dusty's chamber, the familiar mechanical sound somehow reassuring amid the chaos. "We capture one of their officers and ask politely." The plan was audacious to the point of suicidal, but as Reba looked around at the young faces surrounding her, she saw not fear but determination. These Marines had been forged in the crucible of her unconventional training, and now they were about to prove that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways. "Move out," she whispered, and 5 shadows melted into the darkness of the burning base. The drainage tunnel beneath Red Ridge was a claustrophobic nightmare of concrete and corroded metal, barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through. Reba led the way, Dusty slung across her back, her hands and knees scraping against the rough surface as she navigated by feel and instinct. Behind her, Kim struggled to control his breathing as the walls seemed to press in from all sides. "How much further?" he whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Another 50 meters, Reba replied without stopping. "The tunnel connects to the old storm drain system beneath the command center. From there, we can access the building through the basement maintenance areas." The sound of explosions and gunfire was muffled but constant above them, a reminder that their friends were fighting for their lives while they crawled through the bowels of the base. Davis moved behind Kim with his usual quiet efficiency, but even he seemed affected by the oppressive darkness and confined space. As they crawled, Reba found herself thinking about another tunnel, another desperate mission in the mountains of Afghanistan. The similarity was unsettling, the same sense of claustrophobic dread, the same weight of responsibility for the lives of Marines who trusted her judgment. Firebase Delta, September 16, 2010, Hour 6 of the siege. "Red 6, this is Overwatch." Rahimi's voice had been hoarse from hours of radio work, coordinating airstrikes, and calling for reinforcements that never came. "Taliban forces are massing for another assault on the eastern perimeter. We're down to our last belt of ammunition for the SAW." Reba had pressed herself against the concrete wall of the communications bunker, Dusty clutched against her chest. Through the firing port, she could see muzzle flashes advancing across the valley floor like deadly fireflies. The enemy was closing in for the kill, and she was almost out of shells. "Copy that, Overwatch. How many rounds do you have left for the M4? "3 magazines plus whatever the others can spare. Red 6, I need to tell you something. Save it for after we get out of here, Nadia." "No, listen to me. The tunnel system beneath this firebase connects to the old Soviet bunkers on the North Ridge. If we can reach those positions, we might be able to call in artillery support on our own coordinates." Reba had stared at the young radio operator in amazement. After 6 hours of hell, Rahimi was still thinking tactically, still trying to find a way to turn defeat into victory. That's a suicide mission. "The tunnel's been collapsed for years. Not all of it. I've been monitoring the structural sensors. There's still a clear path through the first 100 meters. After that," Rahimi had shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of someone who'd already accepted death. After that, we improvise. In the present, Reba reached the end of the drainage tunnel and carefully pushed aside the metal grate that blocked the entrance to the storm drain system. The space beyond was marginally larger, allowing them to move in a crouch rather than crawling on their bellies. "This is it," she whispered as Kim and Davis joined her in the wider tunnel. "From here, we have access to the basement level of the command center. Once we're inside, we need to move fast and quiet. Our objective is the communications room. That's where their drone operators will be set up." Quote, Kim checked his rifle for the dozenth time, a nervous habit that Reba recognized from her own early combat experiences. "Sergeant, what if we encounter resistance? We're not exactly equipped for close-quarters combat." Reba's smile was grim in the darkness. Private close-quarters combat is exactly what this weapon was designed for. She patted Dusty's stock affectionately. The Winchester 1897 was called the, quote, trench broom during World War I because it could clear a bunker faster than any other weapon of its era. Sometimes old technology is exactly what you need. They moved through the storm drain system with practiced stealth, their earlier training in movement without electronic support serving them well. The sounds of battle grew louder as they approached the command center, indicating that Cruz and Thompson had succeeded in creating their diversion. The basement maintenance area was exactly as Reba remembered from her facility orientation 3 years earlier, a maze of pipes, electrical conduits, and mechanical equipment that provided perfect concealment for their approach. They could hear voices above them speaking in what sounded like heavily accented English. "Russian?" Davis whispered. Reba listened carefully to the conversation filtering down through the ceiling vents. After 20 years of military service, she'd developed an ear for different languages and accents. Eastern European, definitely. Probably mercenaries rather than regular military. The intelligence was significant. Mercenary forces meant this wasn't a state-sponsored operation, but a private military contract. Someone with serious money had hired professional soldiers to attack an American military facility, which raised questions that went far beyond simple terrorism. They reached the access ladder that led to the first floor of the command center. Above them, they could hear the distinctive whine of computer equipment and the chatter of radio communications. The enemy had established their command post exactly where Reba had predicted. "Kim, you're gonna stay here and cover our retreat," she whispered. "Davis, you're with me. We go up fast, eliminate the drone operators, and grab any intelligence we can find. Maximum violence, minimum time." Kim nodded, though his face was pale with anxiety. "What about prisoners? You said we needed to capture an officer for interrogation." "If the opportunity presents itself, we'll take it. But our primary mission is to neutralize their air support and gather intelligence about who's behind this attack." Reba began climbing the ladder, Dusty slung across her back, her movements smooth and silent despite the weapon's bulk. At the top of the ladder, she carefully tested the access panel, then slowly pushed it open to reveal the interior of the command center's main communications room. What she saw made her blood run cold. The room had been transformed into a high-tech military command post, with multiple computer workstations, satellite communication equipment, and banks of monitors displaying tactical information about the base. But it was the personnel that caught her attention. 6 men in military fatigues, all carrying equipment that looked distinctly non-American. And standing at the central console, coordinating the attack with calm professionalism, was a face she recognized from intelligence briefings during her time in Afghanistan. Colonel Viktor Kozlov, former Spetsnaz officer, turned mercenary commander, wanted by Interpol for war crimes in 3 different countries. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a raid on a training facility. It was something much more serious, possibly a prelude to a larger operation against American military installations. She caught Davis's eye and hand-signaled the tactical situation. 6 targets, 1 high-value prisoner, minimal time for engagement. Davis nodded his understanding and prepared to follow her lead. Reba took a deep breath, said a silent prayer for Nadia Rahimi and all the Marines who hadn't made it home, and launched herself through the access panel with Dusty roaring in her hands. The first shot took out the drone operator at Station 1, the heavy buckshot round devastating at close range. The second shot eliminated the communications specialist before he could sound an alarm. By the third shot, the room was in chaos, with surviving enemy personnel diving for cover and trying to bring their weapons to bear. But Reba was already moving, using the mechanical precision of Dusty's pump action to maintain a steady rate of fire that turned the high-tech command center into a slaughterhouse. Davis followed her through the opening, his rifle adding to the carnage as they systematically eliminated threats. In 15 seconds, it was over. 5 enemy soldiers were dead, and Colonel Kozlov was wounded and disarmed, pressed against the far wall with his hands raised in surrender. "Well, well," Reba said, keeping Dusty trained on the Russian colonel while Davis secured the room. "Victor Kozlov, you're a long way from home." Kozlov smiled despite his wounded shoulder, his English perfect despite his accent. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Harlow, your reputation precedes you. I had hoped we might meet under different circumstances." The fact that he knew her name sent ice through Reba's veins. This attack wasn't random, it was personal. The interrogation was brief and brutal. Colonel Kozlov, despite his wounds, maintained the arrogant composure of a professional soldier who'd been captured before and knew he'd likely be exchanged or ransomed within months. But Reba had neither the time nor the patience for conventional questioning techniques. "Who hired you?" she demanded, pressing the muzzle of Dusty against the Russian colonel's wounded shoulder. Around them, the command center's equipment flickered and sparked from damage sustained during the firefight. Kozlov's laugh was genuinely amused. "You think this is about money? You Americans always reduce everything to commerce. Some things, Sergeant, are more important than profit. Such as revenge, justice, the settling of old accounts." Kozlov's eyes glittered with fanatic intensity. "You cost me 20 good men in Kunar province. My government disavowed the operation, but I remember. We all remember." The truth hit Reba like a sledgehammer. The siege at Firebase Delta hadn't been a random Taliban assault. It had been a Russian special operations mission, possibly designed to capture American intelligence assets or eliminate key personnel. Her successful defense had not only saved her Marines, but had also disrupted a foreign military operation on Afghan soil. The Taliban fighters at Firebase Delta were your men, she realized. Local recruits under Spetsnaz leadership, Kozlov confirmed. A textbook foreign internal defense operation, designed to eliminate a troublesome American unit that had been interfering with our regional objectives. "You should have died that night, Sergeant. Your survival was inconvenient." Davis, who had been monitoring the tactical situation through the room's windows, suddenly tensed. "Sergeant, we've got movement. Multiple squads converging on this building. They know we're here." Quote, Reba's mind raced through their options. The command center was defensible, but only temporarily. Eventually, the enemy would bring up heavy weapons or simply burn the building down around them. Their only chance was to break contact and escape before being surrounded. But first, she needed more information. "What's the real objective?" she asked Kozlov. "Red Ridge is a training facility. There's nothing here worth a full-scale military assault." Kozlov's smile was predatory. "Nothing except you, Sergeant. The woman who humiliated Russian special forces and lived to tell about it. My employers were very specific. Bring back proof of your death, along with any surviving members of your Firebase Delta unit." The words chilled Reba to the bone. This entire operation, the sophisticated attack, the electronic warfare, the mercenary assault force, had been designed specifically to eliminate her and anyone connected to the Afghanistan siege. It was personal vengeance, disguised as a military operation. "There's more," Kozlov continued, enjoying her shock. "This facility was chosen not for its strategic value, but because our intelligence indicated you were stationed here. The attack on Red Ridge is merely the first phase of a larger operation designed to eliminate every American survivor of that night in Kunar province." Davis grabbed Reba's arm urgently. "Sergeant, we need to move now. I count at least 30 hostiles surrounding the building, and they're setting up heavy weapons." Reba looked around the command center, taking in the destroyed equipment and the wealth of intelligence materials scattered across the floor. With more time, they could have gathered enough information to expose the entire operation, but time was a luxury they didn't have. "Kim," she called down through the access panel, "we're coming down hot. Prepare to move." She turned back to Kozlov, who was watching her with the satisfaction of someone who'd already achieved his primary objective simply by delivering his message. "You're coming with us," she told him, Insurance policy. I think not, Kozlov replied calmly. Just before Reba could react, he triggered a concealed detonator in his vest pocket. The explosion wasn't large, just enough to destroy the communications equipment and create a diversion. But in the confined space of the command center, the blast was devastating. Davis was thrown against the far wall, unconscious but breathing. Reba found herself on the floor, her ears ringing, and Dusty scattered somewhere in the debris. Through the smoke and confusion, she could hear Kozlov's voice. "Goodbye, Sergeant Harlow. Perhaps we will meet again in hell." By the time her vision cleared, the Russian colonel was gone, probably escaped through a window or emergency exit she hadn't noticed. Around her, the command center was burning, and the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that enemy reinforcements were already entering the building. Reba crawled across the floor, searching desperately for Dusty among the wreckage. Her fingers finally closed around the familiar wooden stock, and she pulled the shotgun to her chest like a long-lost friend. The weapon had survived the explosion with only minor cosmetic damage, a testament to its rugged construction and Spec's careful maintenance. "Davis," she called, shaking the unconscious Marine. "We need to move." Davis's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. "What happened?" "Kozlov had a suicide vest. Minor explosion, but he's gone, and we're about to have company." Reba helped Davis to his feet, noting the blood running from a cut on his forehead. "Can you walk?" "Yeah, I think so." Davis retrieved his rifle and checked his ammunition. "What's the plan?" The sound of boots on the stairs below answered his question. They were trapped on the second floor of a burning building, surrounded by superior numbers, with minimal ammunition, and no hope of reinforcement. It was exactly the situation Reba had faced 13 years ago in Afghanistan, except this time, she wasn't alone. "The plan," she said, moving to the window that overlooked the base courtyard, "is to hold this position until our people can link up with us. Kim's still in the basement, and hopefully Cruz and Thompson are still operational. We make our stand here." Through the window, she could see the tactical situation clearly. Enemy forces had established a perimeter around the command center, but they were being cautious, probably because they'd lost contact with their leadership and weren't sure what they were facing. Reba counted shells, 4 rounds left in Dusty plus 2 more in her pocket. Davis had 1 magazine for his rifle. Against 30 or more professional soldiers, it wasn't much, but it was enough to start with. "Davis," she said, settling into a firing position at the window, "remember everything I taught you about making every shot count. We're not trying to win a battle, we're trying to survive long enough for help to arrive." "What help?" Davis asked reasonably. "Communications are down, the base is isolated, and for all we know, everyone else is dead." Reba smiled as she sighted down Dusty's barrel at the enemy forces below. "Private, in my experience, there's always help coming. The question is whether you can stay alive long enough to see it arrive." The first enemy soldier appeared in the courtyard, moving cautiously toward the building entrance. Reba tracked him through Dusty's simple bead sight, leading the target slightly to account for movement and distance. "Contact front," she whispered, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across Red Ridge like thunder, and the siege began again. The siege of the Red Ridge Command Center lasted exactly 47 minutes, though for Reba Harlow, crouched at the second-floor window with Dusty growing hot in her hands, it felt like a lifetime compressed into heartbeats and muzzle flashes. The first shot had dropped an enemy soldier at 200 meters, the heavy buckshot devastating even at that range. The second had scattered a 3-man assault team trying to breach the building's rear entrance. By the third shot, the enemy had realized they weren't facing demoralized survivors, but a professional soldier who knew exactly what she was doing. "Sergeant," Davis called from his position at the eastern window, "I count at least 40 hostiles now. They're bringing up heavy weapons. Looks like an RPG team moving to that ridge line." Reba cycled another shell into Dusty's chamber, the mechanical action as smooth and reliable as it had been for over a century. 1 shell left, plus the 2 in her pocket. After that, it would come down to Davis's rifle and whatever improvised weapons they could scavenge from the burning building. "Let them come," she replied, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism that had kept her alive through 20 years of combat. "The closer they get, the more effective this old museum piece becomes." Through the smoke and flame, she could see enemy soldiers moving with increasing caution. Professional mercenaries were smart enough to recognize when they were facing a skilled opponent, and the accuracy of her shots had clearly unsettled them. They'd expected to be mopping up terrified survivors by now, not engaging in a protracted firefight with someone who knew how to use their weapon. Davis fired 3 quick shots at a group of soldiers trying to flank their position, his marksmanship training evident in the way 2 of them dropped immediately. "We can't hold this position much longer. The building's on fire, we're almost out of ammunition, and they're going to start using those heavy weapons any minute." Reba knew he was right. The command center was becoming an oven, with smoke filling the upper floors and flames climbing the walls. In a few more minutes, they'd be forced to choose between burning to death or making a desperate breakout attempt that would almost certainly end in their deaths. But she'd faced similar odds before, in another burning building with another group of Marines depending on her leadership. Firebase Delta, September 16, 2010, Hour 7 of the siege. "Red 6, this is Overwatch." Rahimi's voice had been weak, but determined, filtering through the smoke and static of the damaged radio. "I've got artillery coordinates locked in. They're going to drop danger close fire missions on our position in 30 seconds. Reba had pressed herself against the concrete wall of the communications bunker, dusty empty in her hands, Taliban fighters closing in from 3 directions. The decision to call artillery fire on their own position was a last, desperate gamble. If the calculations were wrong by even a few meters, the shells would kill them instead of their attackers. "Copy that, Overwatch. All Marines, take cover. Incoming friendly fire in 30 seconds. But as she'd prepared for the artillery strike that might save or kill them all, Reba had heard something that changed everything. The distinctive sound of American helicopters approaching from the south. Not the reinforcements that had been promised and never arrived, but a medevac flight that had been diverted from another mission when their pilot heard Rahimi's desperate radio calls. "Red 6, this is Dustoff 77. We're inbound for emergency extraction, pop smoke, and prepare for immediate departure." The rescue had been miraculous, arriving at the exact moment when their position was about to be overrun. But it hadn't been luck or divine intervention. It had been the result of one young radio operator who'd refused to give up, who'd kept calling for help even when help seemed impossible. In the present, as enemy soldiers prepared for their final assault on the burning command center, Reba heard something that made her heart leap with hope, the distant sound of rotor blades cutting through the desert air. "Davis," she said, keeping her voice carefully controlled despite the surge of adrenaline, "do you hear that?" Davis cocked his head, listening intently over the sound of gunfire and burning debris. His face broke into a grin that transformed his usually serious expression. "Helicopters. Multiple aircraft approaching from the northeast." Through the smoke and flames, Reba could see the enemy soldiers looking up in confusion as the sound of approaching aircraft grew louder. Their communications had been disrupted by the destruction of the command center, leaving them uncertain about whether the helicopters were reinforcements or enemy aircraft. The uncertainty lasted exactly 15 seconds, until the first Apache gunship crested the ridgeline and opened fire with its 30mm chain gun. What followed was not a battle but a systematic destruction of the mercenary force. The Apaches had thermal imaging that could see through smoke, precision weapons that could eliminate individual targets without endangering friendly forces, and most importantly, pilots who knew the difference between legitimate military personnel and foreign mercenaries operating on American soil. Reba watched from her window as enemy soldiers scattered across the compound, their professional discipline evaporating under the devastating accuracy of the attack helicopters. Some tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Others attempted to fight back with small arms fire that was pathetically inadequate against armored aircraft. Within minutes, the siege was over. "Red Ridge Command Center, this is Apache Lead," a voice crackled through Davis's field radio, which had somehow survived the explosion and resumed functioning. "Be advised, we have friendlies in your building. Identify yourselves and your status." Reba keyed the radio with hands that were surprisingly steady despite everything they'd been through. "Apache Lead, this is Master Gunnery Sergeant Harlow, Red Ridge Training Staff. 2 friendly personnel in the command center, wounded but ambulatory. Building is on fire and structurally compromised." "Copy that, Sergeant Harlow. We're putting down a bird for immediate extraction. Stay in your current position until we can get you out safely." Quote. As the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, Reba felt something she hadn't experienced since that night in Afghanistan, the profound relief of survival against impossible odds. But mixed with the relief was a deeper satisfaction, The knowledge that everything she'd tried to teach her recruits about adapting, improvising, and overcoming had been validated in the crucible of actual combat. "Sergeant," Davis said quietly, looking out at the burning base compound, "what happened to Kim? And Cruz and Thompson?" Before Reba could answer, her radio crackled again with a familiar voice. "Red Ridge Command, this is Private Cruz. We're at the motor pool with 3 other survivors, including Private Kim and Thompson. We've secured the area and are ready for extraction." The wave of relief that washed over Reba was so intense it was almost physical. Her Marines were alive. The young soldiers who'd mocked her methods and questioned her experience had not only survived their first taste of combat, but had emerged victorious. 20 minutes later, as medics checked her wounds and intelligence officers began their preliminary debriefing, Reba learned the full scope of what had happened at Red Ridge. The attack had been planned for months, with Colonel Kozlov's mercenary force conducting detailed reconnaissance and inserting sleeper agents to disable the base's electronic defenses. The assault force had numbered nearly 60 professional soldiers, armed with military-grade equipment and supported by sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. They should have succeeded. By every reasonable military analysis, the attack should have resulted in the complete destruction of Red Ridge and the elimination of all personnel. The fact that it had failed was due entirely to the quick thinking and unconventional tactics of 5 Marines who'd learned to fight without relying on technology. "Ma'am," said Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the intelligence officer conducting the debriefing, "preliminary investigation suggests this attack was specifically targeted at you personally. We've identified several communications intercepts, indicating that eliminating you was the primary objective, not capturing the facility." Reba nodded, unsurprised by the confirmation. "Colonel Kozlov made that clear during our brief conversation. This was revenge for Firebase Delta." Quote, "About that," Mitchell continued, consulting her classified files, "there are some inconsistencies in the official record of that engagement. The after-action report credits Colonel Barnes with the successful defense, but the Marines who were there tell a different story." "Ancient history," Reba replied firmly. "What matters is that my people made it home alive." But Mitchell wasn't finished. "Sergeant, there's something else you need to know. This attack on Red Ridge wasn't an isolated incident. We've identified at least 3 other planned operations targeting Firebase Delta survivors. If we hadn't stopped Kozlov here, he would have moved on to eliminate every Marine who served under your command that night." The implications hit Reba like a physical blow. Her survival hadn't just saved her own life. It had protected every Marine who'd trusted her leadership during the siege. The young soldiers who'd looked to her for guidance, who'd followed her orders even when they seemed impossible, were alive because she'd refused to let Kozlov complete his mission of revenge. Later that evening, as the base smoldered and investigation teams combed through the wreckage, Reba found herself sitting on the steps of the temporary medical station, Dusty propped beside her like an old friend. The shotgun had suffered cosmetic damage during the firefight, new scratches on the stock, a dent in the barrel where it had been thrown against a wall, but it remained fully functional, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. "Sergeant?" Private Cruz approached tentatively, her uniform torn and dirty but her bearing confident in a way it hadn't been before the attack. "I wanted to thank you for everything you taught us. Without those lessons about improvising and adapting, we never would have survived." Reba looked up at the young Marine, seeing not the uncertain recruit who'd arrived at Red Ridge weeks ago, but a combat veteran who'd proven herself under fire. "You survived because you had the courage to trust your training and think for yourself when it mattered most. That's not something I can teach, that comes from inside." Kim appeared beside Cruz, his earlier arrogance completely absent. The cocky young Marine who'd mocked her antique weapon was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned the difference between confidence and competence through direct experience. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I thought your methods were outdated, that modern technology had made traditional skills obsolete. I was wrong about everything." "No, Private, you weren't entirely wrong," Reba replied, surprising him. "Technology is important, and modern weapons have capabilities that older systems can't match. But technology is just a tool. The most important weapon any Marine carries is between their ears." Thompson and Davis joined the group, creating an impromptu circle around their instructor. In the distance, helicopters continued to ferry wounded personnel to medical facilities. while investigation teams documented the scene for what would undoubtedly become a classified case study in asymmetric warfare. "What happens now?" Thompson asked. "Will they rebuild Red Ridge?" Reba shrugged. "That's above my pay grade. But first, suspect the Marine Corps will be very interested in understanding how 5 Marines with minimal equipment managed to defeat a professional assault force with superior numbers and technology. By remembering that Marines have been adapting and overcoming for over 2 centuries, Cruz said, technology changes, but the fundamentals remain the same." "Exactly." Reba stood up, shouldering Dusty with the same casual familiarity she'd shown for 3 years. "Which reminds me, there's paperwork to fill out, statements to give, and probably a dozen congressional hearings to attend. But first, I need to write some letters." "Letters?" Kim asked. "To the families of every Marine who served at Firebase Delta. They deserve to know that the threat against their loved ones has been eliminated, and that their sacrifice 13 years ago wasn't forgotten." As the group began to disperse, Cruz lingered behind. "Sergeant, there's something I need to tell you. I've been researching the Firebase Delta engagement, and I found some discrepancies in the official record. The after-action report doesn't match the testimony of the Marines who were there." Reba's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The report credits Colonel Barnes with planning and executing the defense, but the Marines I interviewed tell a different story. They say you were the one who organized the defense, that you were the one who kept them alive through 7 hours of hell." "Ancient history," Reba repeated, but with less conviction than before. "Maybe, but history has a way of eventually getting the facts right." Cruz pulled out her phone and showed Reba a document she'd been preparing. "I've been working on a comprehensive report about unconventional tactics in modern warfare, using tonight's engagement as a case study. I think it's important that people understand what really happened here." Reba looked at the document, seeing her own actions described with the kind of objective analysis that military historians would study for decades. It was strange to see her life reduced to tactical decisions and casualty statistics, but she had to admit that Cruz had captured the essential truth of what had happened both tonight and 13 years ago in Afghanistan. "You know," she said finally, "there's something I need to show you." She led Cruz to her quarters, which had somehow survived the attack despite being located in one of the targeted buildings. From her footlocker, she withdrew a sealed envelope that had been waiting there for over a decade. "Nadia Rahimi recorded this message during the Firebase Delta siege," Reba explained, her voice carefully controlled. "She knew we might not all make it out, so she wanted to leave something behind for the families of the Marines who served with us." She handed Cruz the envelope, which contained a small digital recorder and a handwritten note. Cruz read the note silently, her eyes widening as she understood its significance. "She recommended you for the Medal of Honor," Cruz whispered, "for your actions during the siege, but the recommendation was never submitted because Colonel Barnes claimed credit for the defense." Reba nodded. Nadia believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. She would have wanted the truth to be told eventually. "And now it will be," Cruz said firmly. "People need to understand that courage isn't about having the best equipment or the most advanced technology. Sometimes it's about making do with what you have and refusing to give up when everything seems hopeless." 3 months later, Master Gunnery Sergeant Reba Harlow stood at attention in the East Room of the White House as the President of the United States pinned the Medal of Honor to her uniform. The citation read, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as non-commissioned officer in charge of Firebase Delta, Kunar Province, Afghanistan, and later as senior instructor at Red Ridge Training Facility, California." Quote, "The ceremony was attended by representatives from every branch of the military, senior government officials, and most importantly, the families of the Marines who had served under her command. In the front row sat an elderly woman who introduced herself as Nadia Rahimi's mother, her eyes bright with tears as she watched the recognition that had been 13 years in the coming. After the ceremony, as Reba posed for photographs with dignitaries and answered questions from reporters, she was approached by a young Marine in dress blues who looked barely old enough to shave. "Ma'am," the Marine said nervously, "I'm Private First Class Jessica Torres. I'm starting instructor training next month at the new Red Ridge facility, and I wanted to ask, will you be teaching there?" Reba looked at the young woman, seeing in her face the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that she'd seen in countless Marines over the years. Some things never changed, no matter how much technology advanced or how much the world evolved around them. "Private," she said with a smile. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." The new Red Ridge training facility opened 6 months later, incorporating lessons learned from the attack into a comprehensive program designed to teach Marines how to operate effectively in any environment, with any equipment, under any circumstances. The facility's museum contained a special display case featuring a Winchester Model 1897 shotgun, donated by Master Gunnery Sergeant Reba Harlow, with a plaque that read, "Some weapons become obsolete. Others become legendary." But Reba kept the original Dusty, of course. Old friends were too valuable to put behind glass, especially when there were still lessons to teach and Marines to train. Every morning at 0500, she could be found at the range, the familiar weight of the shotgun in her hands, preparing for another day of showing young Marines that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways. The recruits still joked about her antique weapon, at least until they saw what she could do with it. Then the jokes stopped and the real learning began. After all, some traditions were worth preserving, no matter how much the world changed around them. Epilogue. 5 years later, CNN military affairs correspondent James Peterson interviewed Master Gunnery Sergeant Reba Harlow for a documentary about the Red Ridge incident. When asked about her philosophy of training, she gave an answer that would be quoted in military academies for decades to come. "Technology will always change. Weapons will become more sophisticated. Communications will become more advanced, and tactics will evolve to meet new threats. But the fundamentals of leadership, courage, and adaptability remain constant. A Marine who can think clearly under pressure, who can improvise solutions when standard procedures fail, and who refuses to quit when faced with impossible odds, that Marine will succeed regardless of what equipment they're given." She paused, looking out the window at a group of recruits practicing marksmanship with the latest electronic targeting systems. "My job isn't to teach them how to use the newest gadgets. My job is to teach them how to be Marines. Everything else is just details." The interview ended with Peterson asking about the future of military training in an increasingly technological world. Reba's answer was characteristically direct. "The future belongs to warriors who understand that the most sophisticated weapon system ever created is still the human mind. Train that properly, and everything else becomes possible." As the camera crew packed up their equipment, Peterson noticed the old Winchester shotgun mounted on the wall behind Reba's desk. When he asked about it, she smiled and gave the same answer she'd been giving to curious visitors for years. "That's Dusty. He's retired now, but he still likes to keep an eye on things. Old soldiers never really fade away, they just find new ways to serve." The shotgun, of course, said nothing. But if weapons could speak, Dusty might have added that some partnerships transcend time, technology, and circumstance. Some bonds are forged in fire and proven in blood, becoming stronger with each passing year. Some friendships, like some weapons, are simply built to last. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.